16 June 1944. Low over the green and brown patchwork of the Eastern Front, a German fighter pilot rolled his Bf-109 into the sun and looked down for the easy kill. The sky beneath him seemed busy with the usual targets: ground attack aircraft crawling toward the front line, escorts weaving tight patterns, everything pressed close to the earth, where Soviet air power lived and died. Then he saw them, small, clean silhouettes, sliding up toward his altitude like thrown knives. Not LA-5s with their blunt noses. Not the familiar Yak-9s with their longer lines. These looked lighter, tight, almost too small to carry an engine worth fearing. He said something into the radio that made his wingman laugh. A minute later, the laughter stopped, because the tiny Soviet fighters did not turn away. They did not flinch under the first diving pass. They rose into the attack as if the rules had changed while the Germans were still speaking yesterday's language. One of the small Yaks snapped into a climbing turn that should have bled it dry of speed, and somehow it stayed alive, nose still hunting, propeller biting air like an animal's jaw. The German pilot hauled back, felt his own aircraft grow heavy, felt the front shudder as the stall warning crept in. He expected the Yak to fall away. It did not. The Soviet fighter slid into a position where its guns could speak, and in the next heartbeat, the German pilot had to choose: keep turning and die, or dive and pray he could outrun something that had no business clinging to his tail. He chose the dive, and discovered the second surprise. For much of the war, the Luftwaffe had ruled low altitude in the east, with experienced men hardened across thousands of sorties, flying aircraft whose weaknesses they understood the way a craftsman understands a familiar tool. By the summer of 1944, that confidence had become reflex. But on that day, over that sector of the front, a new reality arrived in the compact shape of the Yakovlev Yak-3. This story was not about the fastest fighter at 30,000 feet. It was about a small aircraft built for knife-range combat over the battlefield, and how it turned the most common air war on the Eastern Front low, violent, close to the ground, into a place where even veteran Luftwaffe pilots began to feel hunted. It was about how an airplane that looked almost modest became, in the right altitude band, a nightmare. And it began long before June 1944, back when the Soviet Union was still bleeding and rebuilding at the same time. In 1941 and 1942, Soviet fighter aviation fought with what it could get to the front. The Yak-1 had proven itself as a workable foundation, fast enough, agile enough, and, crucially, possible to manufacture under pressure. But the men who flew it learned the truth that never appeared on propaganda posters. An aircraft could be good and still get pilots killed if it carried excess weight, if it asked too much of its engine, if it demanded perfect maintenance in mud and frost. Yakovlev's design bureau did not chase a miracle. It chased grams. The result was an idea that sounds simple and is brutally hard in practice. Take what already worked, then carve away everything that was not essential to winning a turning fight at low and medium altitudes. The prototype lineage that led to the Yak-3, often traced through the Yak-1M, focused on a smaller wing area, cleaner aerodynamics, and a careful redistribution of cooling and drag so the aircraft could accelerate and climb like a lighter class of machine. On paper, it did not look like a revolution. It looked like refinement. But refinement was exactly what the battlefield needed. By 1943, the Soviets understood that their air war was fought close to the front, escorting Il-2 Sturmovix, intercepting German fighter bombers, brawling over river crossings and railheads, losing and gaining air superiority in hours rather than months. Above the battlefield, the air was never empty. It was crowded with decision, and decision favored the aircraft that could change direction fastest, regain speed quickest, and punish a mistake before the enemy could escape. The Yak-3 was designed to live in that world. It was small enough that, at a distance, it could look like a lesser threat than it was. It concentrated its weapons near the center line, where bursts could be placed with a surgeon's certainty rather than scattered across wide wings. It used an engine from a familiar family, the Klimov VK-105 series, pushed into a configuration that made the most of the air where Soviet pilots fought, below the altitudes where German aircraft often preferred to start the engagement. And it was built with the kind of practicality that mattered to ground crews who worked with cold hands and no patience for fragile miracles. Easy to maintain was not a marketing line on the Eastern Front. It was a survival trait. Even so, the Yak-3 arrived late. It did not meet the Germans of 1941 when Luftwaffe formations cut through Soviet skies like knives through cloth. It arrived in 1944 when German pilots were still dangerous, but the conditions around them were collapsing fuel scarcity, training cuts, replacement pilots with fewer hours, squadrons forced to fight and retreat and fight again. That timing mattered, because the Yak-3 did not need to be perfect. It needed to be perfect for the moment. The first Yak-3s reached frontline units in the summer of 1944. One of the units tasked with proving the aircraft under combat conditions was a Soviet fighter regiment of the 2nd Air Army, the 91st IAP, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Yakovlev. The mission was straightforward and brutally ambitious: gain air superiority. In late spring and early summer, that phrase often meant a series of violent skirmishes that began with escorts and ended with whoever still had fighters in the air. The Yak-3 entered this environment not as a legend, but as an unknown. Soviet pilots were cautious at first. New aircraft did not automatically mean safety. A machine could be fast and still betray its pilot in a dive. It could turn beautifully and still overheat in the wrong conditions. Everyone on the line had seen improvements that arrived with hidden costs. So they tested it the only way a war accepts: in combat. During June and July 1944, the unit flew hundreds of sorties in the Yak-3 and claimed significant results, including notable losses inflicted on German fighters and Stukas in that sector. Claims in air war were always imperfect. Smoke and speed and distance turned certainty into argument, but what mattered was not the arithmetic. What mattered was the change in behavior that followed. On 16 June 1944, a larger dogfight erupted. 18 Yak-3s clashed with 24 German aircraft. A swirling fight that compressed into minutes and dissolved into scattered chases over the front. It was the kind of engagement Luftwaffe veterans expected to manage: hit from above, force the enemy down, disengage when needed. But the Yak-3 did something unpleasant to those expectations. It climbed into turns that should have been losing propositions. It accelerated out of mistakes faster than German pilots assumed a Soviet aircraft could. And when it got its guns aligned, the concentrated fire near the nose made brief bursts count. For the German pilots in that fight, the shock was not that the Yak-3 was invincible. The shock was that it denied them the comfortable middle ground, the place where a veteran could make a small error and survive it. The Yak-3 punished those errors quickly. A day later, Soviet accounts described Luftwaffe activity in that area dropping sharply. Whether that was a temporary lull, a shift in tasking, or the natural rhythm of operations, the impression inside Soviet units was clear. Something had changed. They had a fighter that could decide low-altitude fights instead of merely enduring them. But a new fighter did not own the sky because pilots believed in it. It owned the sky only when pilots and commanders learned how to make its strengths unavoidable. The Yak-3's strengths were not mysterious. They were brutally practical. It felt light on the controls. It could change direction quickly, without bleeding away as much energy as a heavier opponent. It climbed well in the altitude band where most Eastern Front fights happened. It accelerated in ways that let a pilot snatch initiative after a brake turn. Its weaknesses were just as real. It was not built to dominate at high altitude where air grew thin and engines lost their edge. Its range was limited, which mattered less over the front than it would have over the Atlantic, but still shaped how long it could loiter. And its mixed construction included components that could suffer under harsh stress if handled outside the envelope, especially in high-speed dives. That meant doctrine mattered. Soviet commanders did not need to reinvent air combat. They needed to keep it in the Yak-3's world. They did this in small, ruthless ways. Patrol altitudes stayed lower. Interceptions were planned to end in turning fights rather than vertical chases into the thin air. Pilots were encouraged to use the Yak-3's responsiveness to get the first shot instead of circling into prolonged duels. The goal was to force German aircraft, often heavier, often optimized for different bands of performance, into a fight that felt like wrestling in a cramped room. German pilots adapted too. They always did. A Bf-109G, properly flown, could still kill any opponent in the sky. A FW-190 could still smash through a formation with cannon fire and disappear. The Luftwaffe's instinct, once they understood what they were facing, was to attack from above where possible, using altitude as savings in a bank, spending it in a fast pass, then climbing away before the Yak-3 could claw back up. But that solution depended on fuel, timing, and discipline. By 1944, those were increasingly scarce. Every German pilot who had survived the Eastern Front learned the same truth. The most dangerous fights were not the ones planned on maps. They were the ones that began suddenly, low, with little room to maneuver and nowhere to recover lost energy. In those fights, the Yak-3 became a kind of invisible trap. It did not need to be superior everywhere. It needed to be superior where the fight actually happened. The French of Normandie-Niemen understood this almost immediately. They were experienced combat pilots flying with Soviet forces, and by mid-1944 they transitioned to the Yak-3. They did not need propaganda to tell them what mattered. They knew the feel of an aircraft through the stick. They knew what it meant to tighten a turn without feeling the machine fall away. They knew the difference between firing a long burst to walk rounds onto a target and firing a short, confident burst because the guns sat close to the pilot's line of sight. Their late-war missions carried them into increasingly dangerous airspace over the Baltic region and toward East Prussia as the front rolled west. In one typical escort, fighters would weave above attack aircraft and bombers, waiting for the telltale flash of German dives. When the German formation appeared, the fight would compress into seconds of instinct, a brake turn, a snapshot, a climb that might not be a climb, but a lure. In that environment, the Yak-3's small size mattered in a way technical manuals never fully captured. It made the aircraft harder to see in a crowded sky. It made deflection shots more difficult. It made German pilots waste a fraction of a second confirming what they were aiming at, and a fraction of a second was the only currency that mattered. There was a particular kind of fear among fighter pilots, the fear of an opponent who did not behave as expected. Not because he was reckless, but because his aircraft allowed him to choose options that did not exist in the opponent's mental model. The Yak-3 created that feeling. It was not a miracle plane. It was a plane that made certain mistakes fatal. By late 1944, as the Red Army pushed west with relentless force, the air war became less about elegant duels and more about preventing collapse, protecting bridges, rail lines, retreat routes, and the battered remnants of ground formations. In these desperate conditions, Luftwaffe pilots often had to fly missions at low altitude, whether they wanted to or not, ground attack, quick interceptions, hurried escorts. Those were exactly the altitudes where the Yak-3 waited. And there was another factor that did not show in performance charts: the changing quality of pilots. Early in the war, Luftwaffe veterans were often better trained and far more experienced than their opponents. By 1944, that gap narrowed and, in many cases, reversed. German flight training suffered under fuel shortages and constant operational demand. Replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours and less practice. In combat, they leaned on doctrine and hope, and both were brittle. Soviet training had its own brutal constraints, but by 1944, the Soviet system had matured under pressure. Pilots had hard-earned battlefield knowledge. Units developed practical tactics tailored to their aircraft. Ground crews were experienced in keeping engines running under conditions that would have grounded peacetime squadrons. The Yak-3 fit that matured machine perfectly. Production reflected this focus. The Yak-3 was built in large numbers, thousands of aircraft, by Soviet factories that had learned to deliver fighters under wartime strain. Major plants included No. 2292 in Saratov and No. 31 in Tbilisi. The aircraft reached operational service in 1944 and continued production beyond the war's end, becoming one of the most significant late-war Soviet fighters by sheer presence as well as reputation. For Luftwaffe pilots, this created a grim pattern. They could win individual encounters, any skilled pilot could, but they could not win the trend. As the front moved and bases shifted, they faced more Yaks, flown by pilots increasingly comfortable in their machines, within an environment that forced low-altitude fighting. Their own advantages, altitude, initiative, time, became harder to secure. So the mocking stopped. It did not stop because the Yak-3 was unbeatable. It stopped because the Yak-3 was honest. It made the fight honest. If a German pilot entered a turning fight low to the ground against a Yak-3, he had to fly perfectly and still might die. If he tried to dive away, he risked giving up the one advantage the Yak-3 could: contest speed in the band where the engine and airframe were happiest. If he tried to climb away, he had to do it fast and early, before the Yak's lightness turned the chase into a rising knife fight. That did not feel like the Luftwaffe of 1941. It felt like the sky itself had switched sides. And for the Soviet pilots flying the Yak-3, the psychological effect was just as real. Confidence in a fighter was not abstract. It was the willingness to commit. It was the ability to pull into a turn and believe the aircraft would still be there 1 second later. It was the knowledge that a split-second window for a shot would not be wasted by guns that were too far out on the wings or by a platform too heavy to stabilize. When Soviet pilots talked about the Yak-3 after combat, they often returned to one simple idea. It did what they asked. It did not lecture them with limitations at the moment they needed it most. That, more than speed figures, was why the Yak-3 owned the eastern sky that mattered, the sky just above the battlefield, where armies moved, where bridges stood or fell, where retreat routes lived or died. Still, time was the Yak-3's final limitation. It arrived when the war's strategic outcome was already tilting irreversibly. It did not need to win the war alone, and it could not have. But it sharpened the Soviet air war at exactly the point it needed sharpening, turning local air superiority into something more reliable, more repeatable, more cruel for an enemy already running out of margin. After the war, the Yak-3's reputation outlived its brief frontline glory. It served beyond 1945 and into the early post-war years in several air forces, remembered less as a symbol and more as a feeling. Lightness, responsiveness, the sense that an aircraft could be an extension of intent rather than a compromise. Some wartime tallies and losses will always be debated because air war was messy and memory was imperfect. But the arc of perception was not in doubt. A small fighter that looked almost too modest to fear had forced veteran opponents to change how they fought. It did not do it with a headline-making wonder engine or an exotic weapon. It did it by ending the comfortable assumption that Soviet fighters could be safely underestimated at low altitude. On 16th June 1944, a German pilot rolled into the sun expecting an easy hunt. He saw tiny fighters climbing laboriously toward him and assumed the same story would repeat. He was wrong. The Yak-3 did not simply meet the Luftwaffe in the air. It met them where they lived, in the low, brutal, unforgiving sky above the front, and made that sky feel like a trap. By the time he understood what he was fighting, the old habit of laughing was already dead. And the eastern sky, at the altitudes that mattered, belonged to the tiny Yak.